Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session. We are experiencing some technical difficulties, and our moderator, Hannah, hasn't been able to join. On top of that, our first speaker is just about to leave and travel to New York. So we will continue with introductions and welcoming notes a bit later on in this presentation, but we'll start with our first speaker straight away because she needs to leave and travel to the airport.
So thank you, Anna, for your kind introduction, and sorry for the difficulties. So today we're here to talk about the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement in times of COVID-19. And we are going to be talking with the wonderful experts that we have in the panel about the challenges and the path ahead. So my role, it is as an international economics professor. So I'm going to speak briefly in global terms about the economic trade-related situation in the African continent and the impact of the pandemic. So before the pandemic hit the continent, Africa was enjoying a period of high dynamism in terms of trade and growth. Trade was growing, as you see in the chart, at a rate, double digits rate, close to 10%, and in previous years was even growing at 13%. So it was the highest dynamic region in the world. And in terms of growth, especially in Central Africa and in Eastern African, if you know the history of Africa, those countries were growing at a 6-7% rate, which is quite remarkable. In parallel, 55 countries in the region were engaged in negotiations and in the different phases for the implementation of the most ambitious trade agreement in the area that actually has the potential to become the largest free trade zone in the world. We are talking about 55 states, 30 of them already signed the agreement, 1.3 billion people, and a gross domestic product of $3.4 trillion. And then the pandemic started spreading in the continent a little bit later than the Western countries. At the end of March, they were recorded, the first cases, and it hit really badly the continent. We believe that our estimates that the forecasting are telling us that the most dynamic sectors, those that are actually trading services, are going to experience a huge decline that is going to be in between 20 and 30%. And that is going to hit particularly travel and hospitality. So given this environment, the key question here is, could COVID-19 be a first nail in the coffin of the African free trade area? Well, the majority of experts, I particularly think that is actually the opposite. The pandemic could even help the project to gain momentum. And let me explain this, what I mean with that. And I want to give you a couple of examples. The impact of COVID-19 has been especially hard for those African countries that are landlocked. They don't have access to the sea. Those countries were virtually totally cut off from the world because of the closure of the borders. And then it pushed coordination across African countries to actually establish trade corridors. And that was only possible because they were already in negotiations for the trade agreement, and they were already engaged into the implementation of the trade agreement. So the governments agreed to establish those trade corridors, and also the pandemic allowed to push the local innovation. So, for example, Kenya started producing PPE equipment, South Africa started producing ventilators, and those trade corridors allowed those essential goods to actually travel across countries and actually get into the population that it was in higher need. So here is where the ACFTA comes into play. For the whole Africa to benefit from all these innovations, all this talent, we need actually fewer barriers, and it actually allowed to push the spirit of cooperation that, if you know the history of Africa, it has been difficult before. The comparative advantage in Africa is in trading services, especially transport, travel, and financial services. Those travel, hospitality, and transportation has been really, really hit by the pandemic. But financial services have been behaving relatively remarkably. Why? Because the trade agreement allowed to push for the launching of digital payments, electronic payments. Many of the paperwork that is done in customs now is digital, which wasn't the case before. So this has contributed to the efficiency, and that's the competitiveness of trade in the continent. But I mean, I don't want to be very naive. There are challenges ahead, but you have to realize that trade and the fact that we have now a regional agreement that promotes highly integration is going to be the key to actually fight against future shocks and against the pandemic, because many of the African countries actually lack the policy space to implement monetary policy and fiscal policy, to inject trillions of dollars into the economy and put money into people's pocket. That's the case in United States. That's the case in many European countries. But it is not the case in many African countries. And trade is going to be a crucial factor in the recovering from the pandemic. It's going to use that policy space. Obviously, what do we need for that to happen? We need an effective trade policy and especially good governance and increasing trust. My colleagues are going to be talking about these points. So in my opinion, in more detail. In my opinion, what is highly needed now in the continent, it is coordination of policies, building trust, networks improvement, especially access to funding for small businesses and medium-sized businesses, entrepreneurs, women that are traders that have been highly impacted. And finally, they need improvement in trade logistics, custom processes, and clearance. So my colleagues now, they will take over and they will expand on these points, which I think are the main challenges for the continent, but the opportunities lie ahead. Thank you.
All right, can you hear me now?
Oh, yes. Yes, we can.
Oh,
Hannah.
amazing.
Welcome.
Oh, that was exciting start, so I was locked out and you had to take over. And, in the spirit of the TradeExperettes, we don't want to do things the regular way. So we're not just having Marta hand over the baton. We're actually going to have her hand over the baton, run to the airport because it's COVID times, and try to get back to New York for the first time in a couple of months.
It's going to take me 2 days.
It's going to take a couple of days. Yeah, right. So go, Marta. We'll take it from here. And with any luck, we are hoping that we can connect back to you once you've cleared security.
Yes,
and if not, have a happy trip. And thank you so much for putting this together.
Thank you. I just offer an overarching view of the economic and trade-related situation in Africa. And yeah, my colleagues, who are wonderful experts in the areas, are going to be actually building up on the points that I just introduced. Thank you all and have a wonderful panel.
We'll take it from here. Have a nice trip. All right, so that was an unusual start. Good morning to some of us who are in this time zone. Good evening to others. Good afternoon. And for those of you who have set your alarm and are still in bed, great timing, great session to pick. This is going to be worth those couple of minutes of not sleeping, I promise. So this is number 36, implementation of AFCFTA in times of COVID. The title is actually Challenges and Path Ahead, but I would like to change it a little bit to Challenges, Opportunities, and the Path Ahead. And as you might have alluded on Twitter, is that I am really, really, really happy that it's Thursday. I'm really, really happy that I get to be here and share the amazing knowledge of these experts here today. It's going to be, like the kids would say, it's going to be lit. So I'm Hannah Norberg. I am the trade economista, and I have the honor and privilege of now that I've actually gotten on board moderating this session. We often start these sessions with saying that we are grateful and honored because it's a nice thing to say, but today I really feel it from the bottom of my heart. I am so grateful to be here today. I am grateful to Richard and to Joost and to Dimitri for stepping up to fill the vacuum that was left in the after the WTO Public Forum, which is such an important thing for us for during the years, right? And they didn't just manage to put it together. They have pulled it off in flying colors. I am really, really grateful for their opportunity, for them asking for the TradeExperettes, who are the organizers of this particular panel, to be their official inclusivity and general awesomeness partners, and to the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for also helping us out to be those partners. I am grateful to all the experts and to all the experts who have helped us to get TradeExperettes to where we are today. And for those who don't know the TradeExperettes as of yet, you could either check us out at tradeexperettes.org or TradeExperettes, the at TradeExperettes on Twitter. We are a network of hundreds of awesome female trade experts. That's a trade expert definition. And we come from all over the world and from all walks of trade. And we do networking, we share expertises, we share experiences, we publish blogs, we offer trainings, we're just about to kick off our mentoring program, and so many other things, and there's many, many, many things coming. So just check out the website, and if you're interested in joining us and helping us to find funding and getting engaged in other ways, there is a way to connect there. So that was my list of gratefulness. I hear if you say thank you 1,000 times a day, you're going to be a very happy person, and I think I've gotten far there already. So I'm grateful for all of that. I am also very, very honored to be moderating this amazing panel, where we intend to not only go from a 30,000 foot view down to very precise policy decisions, but also to give you a full 360. And we already started. So in order of appearance, and we started off with Professor Marta Bengoa, who's at City University in New York and also University of Johannesburg. And she gave us that big background on the macroeconomics and of the trade situation in Africa, as it stood in comparison to a year ago, and then what's happened with COVID. And she pointed out some really interesting both challenges and opportunities. And we will be following up with that before we do that, I'm just going to go through the rules. So the idea is to give everyone about 8 minutes of opening remarks to give their viewpoint and to put us together as in their narrative of where we are. And we have so many different ones, but since this all got shook up a little bit, I'm now gonna stop talking, and I am going to hand over the baton to Komi Tsosowu over at UNCTAD. So why don't you take it, Komi?
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you fine.
Yes. Okay. So good morning, good afternoon. I think everyone is we are scattered across the world. So thank you for the opportunity given to speak at the meeting, and also to present how COVID has affected the AFCFTA implementation. As I'm trying to quickly get my my slide ready. So to quickly start, I want first to present, to quickly talk about the framework of the AFCFTA.
Hang on
As
just
you
one
know,
second. This thing on the
the
screen,
framework as has been
on the screen, I don't think, because it says OWIT, at least on my screen, for the, that seems to be Anne's presentation. Let's see, that's Martha's.
yeah. I think my presentation have my slides have not been added, but maybe the organizer focuses only on experts, and we're not expecting experts. So I will.
Well,
I will
actually,
move
this is your
ahead.
second year in the TradeExperettes, you
Yes.
know,
So
panel. So we would,
I will just then try to be quite, explicit in presenting what I was supposed to present. So I think it's fine. I can present without my slides, and then I will try to be clear enough for everyone to understand what I'm talking about. So to start, I was saying that as you all know, and or most of you know, the EFCFTA framework includes protocols on trade in goods, trade in services, dispute settlement, and also, so those issues have been more or less agreed on over the phase one. Now the phase two issue include negotiations around investment, competition policy, and intellectual property rights. I'm also glad that a third phase has been added, which will then focus on e-commerce. We all know, especially now with COVID impact, that digitalization and e-commerce become a priority. So it's good to see that these are the issues that are going to be negotiated under phase three of the AFCFTA agreement. In terms of process, of course, the COVID and its restrictions have severely impacted the process, the AFCFTA process. The agreement was supposed to officially start. Its operational phase was supposed to start on 1st July 2019, this year. But there has been a number of outstanding discussions that have not been completed before the 1st July due to COVID-related restrictions. So the official operationalization of the agreement has then moved toward next year. But so far, I think Martha mentioned it, 54 out of 55 African Union member states have signed the agreement. Only Eritrea have not signed it yet. The agreement was expected to reach 22 ratification before it enter into force. And the 22 ratification were reached already in May last year. So theoretically, the AFCFTA entered into force, but it's operational. The first trading, as I said, was supposed to start in July this year, but are postponed. Probably there are discussions to finalize the agreement, the pending negotiation, and to start the agreement, the operationalization early next year. So finger crossed. We hope the momentum will be kept behind, the agreement for it to start. And most importantly, we hope countries will be ready for implementations. A number of issues, for example, submission of tariff concessions are to be completed. Rule of origins are also to be completed. I understood from our African Union colleague, Commission colleague, that almost 90% of tariff line have been agreed as far as rule of origins are concerned. So there are still few, but one good news is that in August, this year, the AFCFTA Secretariat headquarters in the operational phase. So we can say that the Secretary General of the AFCFTA Secretariat is one who is from South Africa. So at least from that point, things are moving. Now, one of my main points I want to raise here is, although COVID delayed, the pandemic also delayed the process. The pandemic also across the continent, I think there is a consensus that today deepening regional integration to reduce Africa's dependence on world markets is more than important. When we see trade data, today Africa continues to import more than 50% from the rest of the world. And this situation has increased the continent's vulnerability to the pandemic as well, due to restrictions, supply chain disruptions, and so and so. So the first point, which is very important, is the continent now needs to produce more of what it consumes. Today, we are not going to go into deep in terms of what are the opportunities, but from basic food to services, there are plenty of opportunity, and we have chance and opportunity to discuss with the private sector a lot of times. Second point I also want to mention is, yes, it's also important today that we have seen the vulnerability of our Africa's health systems, that harnessing regional integration opportunity to build stronger health systems are something very important as well. The continent currently imports more than 95% of its medicinal and pharmaceutical product from outside the continent, which is huge. So all these issues, these facts increase the vulnerability of the continent to to crisis, especially health crisis. You may recall that in April, WTO estimated that about 80 countries and custom territory have banned or limited export of essential medical supplies. So if a continent like Africa depends so much on the rest of the world, how can then the continent survive during crisis? So it's here again, I think implementation of the AFCFTA could support a stronger pharmaceutical and system. We have countries like South Africa, Kenya, Ghana, Egypt, Nigeria, and other countries that have also local industry capacity to manufacture medicine. The third point, which is also very important, is how do we leverage on COVID-19 as Africa, the continent, to shape a stronger AFCFTA framework in which that digitalization and, of course, e-commerce play a major role. Now, we need also to have a kind of an AFCFTA framework that prevents country to impose restrictions when there are crises. So when we talk about free trade, it has to be free trade. Yes, I think everyone is also, there is a consensus today that we cannot move as a continent without proper digitalization framework, or without digitalizing our economies. And in that sense, that's why I was saying the phase 3 on e-commerce of the AFCFTA will shape at least a common ground for African countries to scale up their effort toward digitalization and e-commerce practices, which are very important. To conclude, what I want to mention here is, yes, implementation of the AFCFTA now is most important than anything. There are a lot of studies that have already proved the potential of AFCFTA. Recently, World Bank also did a fantastic analysis on that. But we need to move from talk to actions. and political will only will not be enough to make the FCFTA a reality. Martha mentioned implemented coordination, which is very important, both at, that includes partnership at global level, coordination at continental level through the African Union Commission and its partners, coordination also at national level through the national AFCFTA implementation committees that will then build upon the trade facilitation committees that exist already at country level. And of course, at regional level, REX need to also support countries. There are now that COVID has impacted the budget of countries, a lot of issues around financial constraints. Where do you find money to fund EFCFTA implementation, including addressing infrastructure barriers? I'm also glad that UNCTAD 2 days ago released a fantastic study on illicit financial flow that are leaving the continent. And the estimate were about 89 billion USD, which is a minimum, you know. So more than 89 billion are still leaving the continent, and 40 billion are related only to the extractive sectors that are leaving the continent in illicit manner. So these are money that, if we fight against those illicit financial flow, will help continent return more money to implement the AFCFTA and other development agenda, including recovery after COVID. So I think it's very important that we focus on implementation, and then I'm sure, and then I know also the other experts that are going to talk are going to look at the implementation points and some specific challenge on the ground. Thank you, Hannah, for the time, and thank you everyone for taking also the time to hear what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Komi. That's very interesting and an in-depth view of that. I really find it inspirational that during the week of Geneva Trade Week, people have pointed to the AFCFTA as a ray of light, right? As these protectionist and nationalist winds go across the world, Africa is really stepping up here, right? And 55 countries, or at least 54 so far, very diverse countries have stepped up and said, you know, we're going to do it. Also during COVID, this has exacerbated the need for it. And in terms of that, we're also seeing in trade policy in general, we're seeing that people are waking up to making the agreements important for others than just the multinationals, and making sure that trade works for everyone and for SMEs and for, you know, gender, and to unleash the powers everywhere. And so that's a really good segue into what Anne and the Nairobi chapter of OWIT have been putting together in terms of what the agreement actually means and has changed, and as what COVID has implemented for the people who actually do the trading in Africa. So take it away, Anne.
All right. Thank you, Hannah, for this opportunity, and again to the Geneva Trade Week for putting this excellent panel together of the TradeExperettes plus Komi. So today I really wanted to spend some time to really talk about women in trade in Africa, because when we're talking about the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement and we're talking about the implementation, then things that need to be focused on are SMEs, who are majority the women. So I am the executive director at OWIT Nairobi, and what I will start off just doing is just talking about some of the things that we found out immediately the pandemic happened, the COVID-19. We did a survey, and these are some of the things that we found out that we realized is very important for government to understand as policies are implemented, to make sure that they affect the people who really need them. So I'll go in real quick. One of the things that we noticed about the impact of COVID-19 in women in trade is we realized that it affected majority of these women negatively. We saw majority of these women in trade had reduced revenue. We also saw that some people have closed down their business, or what we said, oh, in Nairobi, people have hibernated. So you're still taking a wait and see as things change, because we actually have been encouraging people who are in business and letting them know there are opportunities that are coming. So don't close down the business, just really understand what are the opportunities that will be coming in because of this Africa Free Trade Continental Trade Agreement, so that then now you can take things to the next level. So we do see a negative things that have happened because of COVID, but we see the opportunities that are going to be there. The other interesting thing that we found out is really, and it's in Kenya, and I've also seen that in South Africa and Nigeria, but not all African countries, we've really understood the importance of technology, because as you can see, 90% of the people in business have actually transitioned to working from home. So they're working virtually or having a blend of virtual and on-site, right, in their business premises. This is very important because it shows you the power of technology, because technology means even in times of crisis, business has to go on. And this is what we've noticed that are happening. Of course, there's some things, especially in manufacturing, where somebody has to work on-site, but again, that's also limited. But I can tell you technology has made sure that a lot of women in trade stay in business because of this, regardless of what the pandemic has happened. The other thing we have noticed that are the main constraints for women, this is what they told us, lower demand of goods and services was major. The other thing we saw was cash flow was a problem. So anticipated cash payment issues was a problem. And again, these are things that I think need to be looked at. Staffing was a problem really around how do you manage your staff when they're working virtually, because you can't actually supervise them on site. And then the biggest thing was supply chain disruption. I can tell you a lot of people who had global supply chains, people were doing business in China, in Europe, and that was disrupted. But a lot of people who had regional, for example, us in Kenya, people who were working in the East Africa community, there was less disruption around that. So those are things that I think have been one of the main impacts of COVID-19. But then what are the opportunities? I think there are great opportunities for women in trade in Africa, and that is why the implementation of this free trade agreement is very important. One of the major things is actually digital trade. Digital trade is very critical for women in trade, because what we know about digital trade is the opportunity that will be presented with e-commerce, right? So women will be able to have their e-commerce capability on their website. The other thing we actually see is the emergence of online marketplaces, especially where we're talking about regional marketplaces or continental marketplaces. So this is how we're going to see the growth of trade as people try to access other markets. And this is going to be very important. So even though you don't have a physical presence in an African country, you can still do business there. The other thing we have noticed, the opportunities actually in digital finance. As we continue doing trade, what has happened, especially in Kenya, we've seen the rise of cashless payment. Kenya is known for M-Pesa, which is, and mobile money. But again, we've been seeing more and more people actually going in on online payment platforms. So not only mobile money, but they're able to access Visa or MasterCard payments, credit cards, debit cards. So this is something that we're seeing is the opportunity. So anyone around the world can be able to trade with Africa, and we'll see the rise of more intra-Africa trade. The other thing that we are seeing that we think is an opportunity is digital credit for SMEs, especially based on cash flow. A lot of women in trade and a lot of SMEs are not able to scale up because access to finance is a problem, and I'll be talking about that later on. But what we do see is that as we see more digital trade happening, we'll be able to have more trade data. We'll be able to see data around revenues, and we will see more financial institutions being able to lend money to these women in trade so that they can continue trading. And then the last thing that I think is an opportunity going forward in all African countries is digital trade facilitation. The online facilitation of documentation for imports and exports is very critical. In Kenya, we have KenTrade, which offers a single window system for all transactions happening. And so this is very important because it's going to benefit everyone to understand trade data. We'll also be able to reduce cost for these businesses. So if we do this right all over the continent, then this is going to be something that I think will continue to grow more trade on the continent. I always say that the digital age is here. We've seen it in Kenya. And as more trade data is produced, we'll be able to now have the information that policymakers can be able to make better policies and encourage more business people to actually make better business decisions as they go into other African countries, because that has been limited in the past. But we continue seeing that this is the opportunity that will be able to do that. I can tell you, for example, at OWIT Nairobi, we partner up with ITC. There's a She Trades program. And the last couple of weeks, we've been actually doing training and getting information about export potential. And the reason we have this information is because there's data that shows that. So I encourage you, and I keep telling people that as long as we have trade data, we'll be able to support actually the business community. And then the other thing I really wanted to talk about today is really around implementation. When we talk about why the implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is very important for women, I talk about it in three things. One is access to market. A lot of women have been limited because of access to market and access to the information about this market. So with the implementation of this Free Trade Continental Agreement, then you will see more women actually taking advantage of this. And that is where business membership organizations like OWIT Nairobi come in, because we have the link, or we are able to provide this information to women traders. And so when you're talking about access to market, this will be opened up because many people in Africa will be able to trade between themselves, because there will be reduced barriers, free flow of goods and services and people. The second thing is really access to finance, which I alluded earlier around digital finance. Digital payments, I believe, will enable SMEs to keep track of their revenues, because a lot of times, a lot of funders are not able to give funding because they do not know about these businesses. So as SMEs are able to keep track of their revenues, then people will be able to offer credit. And I foresee the rise of cash flow-based lending versus historically in Africa, which has always been collateral-based funding, which most women or youth in Africa don't have. So that is what I think is going to be very important as we see the implementation of this free trade agreement. And then the third thing I do see is the improved regional supply chains. As I mentioned earlier, most people who are in international trade or regional trade or global trade, a lot of them have focused on the global market. Europe is a big partner, Asia is a big partner, and we also see the US. But again, the challenge for a lot of women has been to be able to travel because of family obligations, the cultural implications in regards to them being able to go and do business outside their country. But as we see the improvement of regional supply chains, I believe, or we believe that's going to be changing. This COVID pandemic has provided an opportunity to reconfigure what I call the global supply chains. So we are reducing reliance on international markets, not eliminating, but reducing the reliance. And then we are seeing the establishment of more regional value chains that will boost intra-Africa trade and secure Africa's productivity capacity for generations to come. Regional integration under the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is urgent, it's important, as we see the resilience of the regional supply chains, and we see the rise of industrialization in Africa and the use of technology. Because I believe technology is a catalyst for trade, right? It's a catalyst for trade and for business, and people can access market information and be able to ease logistics and payment processing, which is very important. I do say that there's going to be a transformational impact of regional trade, largely dependent on the implementation of the Africa Free Trade, Continental Free Trade Agreement, and on the ability of policymakers to ensure that the benefits of trade are spread evenly, not only to large businesses, but SMEs, where women play a critical role. And so governments need to ensure that there's implementation, predictability, and transparency whenever there are trade policies, so that all stakeholders, especially women in trade, can take advantage of that. So thank you again for giving us the opportunity to share what we believe is very important when we're implementing the Africa Free Trade Continental Free Trade Agreement, and what it is that business membership organizations like OIT Nairobi can do to ensure that this is done, and how we can work with government. Thank you again.
Excellent, and that was very insightful and inspiring. All right, so what was your kicking off point here was that you wanted to do the survey so that you could have that information to relay to governments. This is what's happening during COVID to the SMEs. And for that, I would like to I'd like to pivot a little bit and say, all right, so what has been on government's minds during COVID? For African governments, what have they been thinking about, and what have they been struggling with and wrestling with? And what better way than to ask someone who has worked with advising governments on exactly those issues and on WTO law. So Koholo is the perfect person for that. It's lucky that we have you here.
Thank you very much, Hannah. So this has been a very interesting time, obviously not, from a health perspective, but also from a trade perspective, and certainly from an African trade perspective. So as Hannah has graciously introduced, I will be sharing the type of trade-related measures and policies, I guess, regionally, trade nationally and policies regionally that African countries have adopted, and what has been Africa's trade response to the COVID-19 crisis. And then I will just give my general conclusion as to, what would be the best way forward, or maybe one, avenues that African countries can look at to trade their way out of this crisis. So what we have seen generally, and just to let you know, this data or this information that I'm sharing with you public information, because obviously the work that I do would be confidential, and obviously confidential between myself and the country advised. But the information that I got was on actually the WTO's COVID response website. And actually interesting, yesterday, our friends from Global Trade Alert told us that of every one measure that is notified, actually there's 10 that are not notified. So in general, when we look at these notifications, we kind of take them with a pinch of salt. But I think they're also very telling, because there has been, general measures that have been notified that sort of give us an idea of what's happening. Mostly what we've seen on the African continent is that countries have temporarily eliminated import tariffs and duties on what we call COVID-19 goods. So PPEs, medical goods, masks, et cetera, of course, also pharmaceutical products. So obviously why? As Komi has mentioned, vulnerability, right? Africa imports about 94 to 95% of its pharmaceutical products outside of the continent, and obviously, placing or slapping high tariffs on these goods are not going to help the population. So obviously these temporary, waivers of what we call, tariffs and duties have been something that a lot of members have taken. What is also very interesting is that some African countries have applied trade restrictive measures. Interestingly, one country has an import ban on maize and corn, which is interesting because in the times of COVID, you would imagine that we would want more food, but these are the measures that members have taken. And also export ban on COVID-related medical products and vegetables, interesting, which I guess is where members have decided that they do not have enough, either food products or COVID-19 related products internally, and they're going to ban the exportation of that. So these are the sort of type of measures that we think about, especially when we consider the regional integration project. Interesting enough, these are sort of the goods-related measures. So these are the product-related trade measures that members have taken, or African countries have taken. On the other side, we have services-related measures, which Komi and Marta also alluded to the fact that Africa has got huge potential in trade and services, right? But of course, because of COVID, some things had to be changed. And so going from trade liberalism measures that we saw some countries fast-track issuance of operating licenses to make Wi-Fi available, broadly within countries. As you all know, Africa has the least amount, least rates of connectivity in the whole world, and also within the countries going to rural areas that were previously unserved or underserved. And also a extending of validity of existing frequency spectrum licenses due to lockdown, making sure that service providers can still provide those services even though their licenses have expired. Another interesting service that has been liberated, whereas it has previously been restricted, is telemedicine. So some African countries have allowed the use of telemedicine, for obvious reasons, right, to limit the amount of foot traffic in hospitals and clinics. And this has obviously helped a lot of patients and doctors, obviously, not being inundated with people that don't have COVID-related symptoms. And of course, some countries, especially as we know, Africa's COVID management has been not as bad. Of course, in South Africa, which on the continent has the worst, COVID cases, but in other countries, they've managed to reduce that. And of course, telemedicine has been a tool that has been used by some to preempt, the run of the hospitals, and that's helped a lot. And obviously, on the other side, we've seen trade restrictive measures. And of course, when we look at services, this was a necessary evil, right? Because we're looking at transport services. We're looking at, obviously, tourism, education, airline services. And of course, when it comes to tourism, this has really hit African countries. But of course, as I said, it's a necessary evil that had to be taken. Just so countries are slowly opening up. Nigeria's opened up. It's issued, some restrictions and some guidelines that has as to how people should travel. South Africa has just opened up today. Also, we see obviously the services are resuming. But obviously, there's a lot of restrictions as to what type of tests you should have tests, and from which countries they list, and also quarantine measures. So these are just the trade-related aspects of what countries have done to cope. But that was at a national level. We see that there's also been a regional response, which has been quite interesting. And of course, these instruments came out very quickly. What I don't have on the slide, and I do apologize, is the EAC's response, which is one of the first response. So EAC and SADC were the first to respond in April, issuing sort of broad guidelines. And most of them, of course, for our interest is trade facilitating guidelines, right? They identified COVID, goods, fuel, food, medical products that, were said that they should be able to go through borders quite seamlessly and quickly. And obviously on the other side, adopting health measures, right? So the transport, the truckers have to be tested, there has to be some sort of, masks have to be worn, and there's some procedures, health procedures that has to be followed at borders, but at the same time facilitating trade. We've seen COMESA come out a month later, so in May, with their guidelines, which are very similar. And I saw that SADC, EAC, and COMESA have very similar guidelines, sort of very lean guidelines, and asking member states to cooperate, to collaborate, to ensure that there's no disruption in trade. One thing that my colleagues have mentioned was, pre-shipment inspection, digitalization of services that were previously never digitalized. And so for Africa, COVID has really been a boost, sort of a push to where African countries have been talking about all this time. And that's why, for many reasons, COVID has really been positive, to show African countries that they actually can do things that they've been talking about. ECOWAS's guidelines were issued later and in June. And what was interesting about those is that whereas COMESA, SADC, and EAC were very much about, restricting movement, restricting this and that, ECOWAS actually gave guidelines that were very sort of, allowing movement, but also sort of spelling out how it should be done. Definitely wearing masks, keeping distance, disabled people were prioritized at border crossings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it was very interesting to see how the 4 regions, and these 4 regions are the regions that now form what is the AFCFTA, right? have responded to COVID. And interestingly, ECHO actually provided members with PPEs and COVID-related medical products, which other RICs or regional economic communities did not. So obviously, as you know, we have the RICs in Africa, and then we have the AU, which is like a supranational body, and it's not a trade-related body, but it's also interesting to see at the AU level, there has been, dissemination of information, which has been very interesting and helpful, especially for us to track what's happening in the continent, and also, African leaders have been meeting quite regularly to share information. The AFDB, the African Development Bank, has also had a COVID-19 response grant that has been granted to some countries, as we've heard before, that were facing financial difficulties, financial challenges because of COVID. Okay. So this is just my general conclusion, as based on what we've seen, is that African countries have in general managed COVID-19 well, the health aspects of it. However, trade-related responses have been disparate and uncoordinated. For example, we saw in some countries that members or some countries have canceled visas, and those countries at the same time have restricted movement. So you really ask yourself, why do you cancel the visa when people aren't allowed to travel anyway? So, African countries should be very careful not to use COVID as a means of trade protection, or sort of going back and unraveling all of the gains that have been made through the negotiation of the AfCFTA. And as my colleagues have shown, COVID-19 has highlighted and exacerbated Africa's vulnerability, especially with, COVID-related goods, pharmaceutical products. And the AfCFTA, in my opinion, is going to be instrumental in harmonizing and coordinating trade-related policies to make sure that everybody's on the same page and everything's harmonized, instead of having 3 or 2 regions that have got different responses. And also, as we saw in Article 13, or as we see in Article 13 of the agreement, to really establish and to encourage, those regional value chains that are very important, and as Anna said, that are susceptible to less disruption than relying on outside trade. So this is my intervention, and I look forward to talking to you about any questions that you may have.
That was excellent, Koholo. Really interesting, I think. I can't imagine why you would want to restrict food coming into your country, but, sometimes things get tangled. People get crazy at these times, right? And you make decisions, and some are good and some are not good. And then once you realize what's going on and you realize the vulnerabilities, there are some real opportunities and pushes, as you pointed out. So it's, there's always a silver lining. It might take a while, but it's good to shake things up once in a while, I guess. So we've talked about what companies face, and we've talked about how governments have been thinking about this. But where the rubber meets the road really is in customs. And really having with the issues for trade facilitation or getting the goods through customs, getting them from one country to another. And so it happens, we happen to have Anna Yasaska on the line here from Trade Borders Consultancy, who is the TradeExperettes queen on exactly this issue. So Anna, why don't you step in and share your knowledge on the AfCFTA and COVID and borders.
Thank you, Hannah, and thanks everyone for taking the time to listen to us and for bearing with us through what has been a very exciting presentation so far. I wanted to build on what my colleagues have said and wrap up this presentation by talking about how COVID can impact the implementation of this agreement going forward. Once this agreement is negotiated, ratified, everything's done and dusted, it will have to be implemented. And this is where, as Hannah absolutely correctly mentioned, this is where we come across normally a completely different set of challenges than the challenges that we see during the negotiation process. So these challenges are in a way quite international. In a way, what I mean by that is that the challenges are often quite similar, depending, despite which country we're talking about. the basis of it is, what good is an agreement that no one uses? If traders don't use the agreement, if the traders can't use the agreement, there are no benefits of negotiating an agreement. And in terms of agreeing on a customs chapter or customs related aspects of an FTA, this is only step one. Now, for the implementation to happen, other things need to take place. First of all, customs authorities need to understand the agreement, need to correctly apply the agreement and correctly interpret the agreement, which is not necessarily evident every single time. Then traders need to know about the agreement and know that it exists. And the third one is that they need to be able to use it, and they cannot be prevented from doing so by other issues. And all these things will become a bit clearer as I go on. I think the first thing to mention is that there are a number of FTAs or trade agreements or customs unions or even single markets in name in the African region, but they don't necessarily, just because they're in place doesn't necessarily mean that they're utilized and they're fully implemented. In addition to that, there are a number of other obstacles to trade in the region that prevent trade going as smoothly as it could potentially otherwise. There have been a lot of initiatives in terms of trade facilitation, and there are a lot of interesting, very advanced customs related programs. There have been other efforts that my colleagues have mentioned, such as increased use of e-tools and e-payments and so on, access to finance and so on. So there has been a lot done in the last couple of years. However, we still see a number of bottlenecks and a number of issues that are actually quite trivial that prevent people from trading in Africa. For the purpose of this presentation, I'd like to just quickly mention 3 types of challenges and try to see how will COVID impact these challenges and when it comes to implementing of this overarching agreement, and whether or not we have any reasons to be positive and optimistic about this, whether it's potentially an opportunity or not. I should probably also point out that my experience with customs in South Africa, in Africa is actually exactly with South African Customs Union SACO, and in particular with the border between Lesotho and South Africa. However, I'll be mentioning some examples from other places as well. So the 3 issues, the 3 types of issues that I kind of grouped for the purpose of this presentation. The first one was mentioned by Marta, was mentioned by other presenters. That's the lack of awareness. And oddly, this is still the main obstacle to utilization of trade agreements. And that's not only in terms of African region, but that's just generally the case for any region, any country. Just ensuring that traders know that these opportunities exist and that they know how to use them. And that's something definitely that we've came across in Lesotho with the Lesotho traders, that they weren't necessarily aware of all these agreements that exist in the region. And this is particularly important given what Anne was talking about in terms of the type of trade that we have in Africa. So SMEs, on kind of unofficial kind of perhaps trading channels, rural population, or also population that perhaps doesn't speak the official language of the country. So smaller groups of rural population that might be cut off from these preferences for that very reason. And here, I think the impact of COVID will perhaps be slightly negative on this area. And I fully appreciate what Anne was saying about the role of organizations such as the local organizations, as well as international organizations such as UN, the organization I work with, International Trade Center, and number of other organizations, trying to help people to understand and help people to kind of navigate these requirements. However, I think at least in the short term, all these institutions and all the local governments and local institutions will be occupied with other issues, and the additional benefit of potentially using a free trade agreement will, in comparison to just keeping trade flowing, will not be as important, will not be a priority. So I think with lack of awareness of opportunities with trade agreements, we might need to wait a couple of years for that to come back to the pre-COVID level, in my opinion. I hope I'm wrong on this, but I'm just think that there are more important priorities at the moment. The second part, the second challenge, the second issue that we often see are just, and I didn't really know how to call this. These are like other bottlenecks and other issues, and some of them are really, really random and really trivial in a way. I'll give you two examples from the Lesotho-South African border very quickly. One is around VAT, which is something that when you import goods, you pay import VAT, and that's recoverable. With an increased number we had an increased number of cases in the last couple of years whereby the kind of domestic normal VAT hasn't been paid by companies in South Africa, and when the goods entered Lesotho, the VAT wasn't able. The traders weren't able to recover VAT. So basically, for the trader, that means that a good that they're importing all of a sudden becomes much more expensive, much more than what they thought it was going to be, which obviously, once burned, traders try to avoid situations like that. And again, this really has nothing to do with customs. That's just a kind of lack of cooperation or lack of internal ability to trace these people and prevent fraud, which is basically fraud. And the other example is in terms of logistics, really. So Lesotho is a landlocked country, which Martha at the beginning mentioned how difficult this pandemic was for landlocked countries. And it uses, South African ports, obviously, and the one that it uses predominantly is the South African port of Durban. And from the capital, Lesotho, it's a relatively straightforward road to that port. It's a relatively easy and a kind of optimal direction. But from other parts of the country, there are other ways in which goods could be moved to different South African ports that would be much quicker and much more efficient. However, there's a space of a couple of kilometers of road on the South African side that has been damaged and hasn't been repaired. And because of that, because of the simple issue, all the exports from Lesotho have to go all the way to the capital and all the way around to the port of Durban. Now, again, for South African authorities, this is not a priority for obvious reasons. They've got other priorities that are more important to use their limited time and resources. But again, these are issues like that that can potentially prevent trade. And here, I guess there's some limited optimism potentially in terms of what I will speak about next, which is the increased cooperation. And perhaps there's some, when trade becomes crucial, this is where people tend to solve problems. It's the same with trade facilitation. It's when we have a crisis, that's when the attention is on all the little bottlenecks, all the things that stop and prevent trade. And this brings me to my last point, which is the third area where we have a set of challenges and issues when it comes to implementing agreements or when it comes to trading in general. This is trust and cooperation. Trust and cooperation between customs authorities and trust and cooperation between customs authorities and traders. And we've, again, over the last couple of years, in general, Africa, we've seen situations where this trust has been perhaps abused or broken. And once it's broken, it's going to take time and effort to rebuild. A couple of examples here. One in Nigeria. Nigeria has been raising the issue of rules of origin not being used correctly in different trade agreements. And as a result, goods that probably shouldn't have entered Nigerian market under preference have entered Nigerian market. And that's something that local customs authorities perceive as lack of revenue, and rightly so. We've had a similar situation in SACU with Lesotho, with South Africa, and other countries, is that within that customs union, you do not necessarily require a movement certificate, which is for a customs union, it's the equivalent of a rules of origin certificate, a document that allows you to trade under preference within that grouping. And because there was no requirement for that, traders have used the system for several years, which now means that there are up to 16-hour queues at the Lesotho border when entering South Africa, because South African customs authorities have decided to increase controls, and again, understandably so. And this is just to finish the presentation. This is the area where I think there are opportunities in terms of how COVID can impact the implementation of the overarching the new agreement. I think that this because of the crisis and because of the measures that we talked about when it comes to lockdown and also reopening of the continent, or trade corridors, trade of essential goods, initial restrictions that were followed up by gradual easing, all that led to increased cooperation and conversation between customs authorities in the region, and just forced them to work together. And in many areas, this could be an opportunity for the future in terms of implementing these agreements and making customs easier. So these are a mutual exchange of data between the different customs administrations, dispute resolution, things like that, that have for such a long time have been an issue. Perhaps this is an opportunity to make this easier. The same with clarity regarding processes, e-payment, and so on. So I'll stop here, but I think that might be one of the opportunities and one of the positive takeaways from this extremely difficult couple of months that we've all been through recently. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna, for those very practical and yeah, it's something that you can really touch, right? You can really understand what it's like, and these issues of trust, for example, it's such a illicit sort of a concept, but it really is where I mean, if you don't have it, there's nothing, right? And also we were pointing, so to me, there has been a general theme that has been going through everyone's presentation, and that is implementation, implementation, and implementation, right? Getting there, getting from here, which is really good and it's really exciting, and we are seeing very many opportunities, but we really have to get to the final mile in order for people to actually use them and to see the opportunities, right? And so if we could, if I could have you sort of think about that for just a little bit. So for that answers sort of the question, what is the most important thing? But if we were going to take that to the next level and say, all right, so what is it that the African governments must think about in general? And I understand that it's a very difficult thing to answer for generally, because we have a very nationally heterogeneous countries. And so if we start, how about if we start backwards and we talk a little bit about what is it that that you think that the governments need to think about, and just hold that thought for 1 second. And I'm just going to take the opportunity to also encourage all our listeners to post their questions, and I will make sure that we get them through too. So Anna, what do you think is the most important issue that the governments should work on?
I think you might have answered your own question there with your takeaway from all the presentations, which is implementation, implementation, and implementation. No, it's in my area in customs and in terms of just moving goods across borders, it really is that simple. It's cooperation. I think people are very aware of the fact that borders have two sides. And you can't do trade facilitation on one side of the border. Trade facilitation occurs, first of all, on both sides of the border, and then also across the entire supply chain. So again, a lot of what Anne's been mentioning about education, working with traders, working with other providers, service providers, such as hauliers, shippers, and so on. That's also important. So I think it's that. But for customs authorities and for governments, I think it's just this understanding that cooperation is necessary, and especially in a region like Africa. And again, I think Martha mentioned this in her presentation. That's so dependent on each other, and the countries are depending on each other, and there's huge potential in increasing the trade between African countries.
Got it. Thank you, Anna. Koholo, what's your take on that?
Mm-hmm. I think it's just come through in all our presentation, and especially what I mentioned in terms of liberalization of trade measures or restrictions that we see actually didn't make sense, right? You know, it did not probably make sense to limit the number of service providers that can provide internet services, because those are type of things that are needed. And I think when governments sort of individually think about how we're going to implement the AFCFTA, is talking about the trade infrastructure, right? And we're not only talking about what Anna mentioned about roads and, you know, having machines at customs or whatever, but we're also talking about the regulatory framework to permit and to allow trade, and for it to be coherent and for it to be consistent. And then we move from nationally, and then of course, then we have a big overarching regional body which hopefully, this agreement will give us the opportunity to really harmonize trade regulations, or to make them at least sort of equal, and that, creating these regional value chains that we've been talking about, for many, many years becomes a reality.
Yeah, that's a good one too. Let's see, going backwards, that would be Anne now, right?
Yes, thank you, Hannah. Yeah, definitely agree with what Anna said and Kolo, really around, especially what Anna was saying around relationships, trade relations, because we've seen some issues coming up in the East Africa community, especially during COVID. So I do think that African countries need to put together policies that do not go against the spirit of a united Africa. That to me is really important. But more important, I say there are three things government needs to do. Information sharing is very critical. Awareness is critical. I cannot emphasize that. Implementation is critical. But I think where we are going as Africans, we need to really think about industrialization. And I look at it in two ways, really focusing on policies around manufacturing to ensure that African goods are added value before they're exported. That's very critical. The second thing is the fourth industrialization revolution. It is here we're using technology to automate and access data. If governments focus on these two things in Africa, it will greatly transform our economies, and especially the women and the young people of Africa who are well positioned to take advantage of this opportunity. So that is what I would say that government needs to focus on.
Mm.
Hannah, you might be muted.
Oh, I'm muted. All right. So then it's hard for Comey to hear me. It's hard for anyone to hear me. Comey, you're up.
Yes, yeah, thanks, Hannah. Thanks, colleagues, as well. And has been very interesting discussion so far. I have three critical points to put forward. Implementation is very important. First, I think we also need to put the private sectors at the core, at the center of the EFCFT implementation. And because who is going to produce for the markets? The private sectors. But at the same time, I also call the private sectors to do more in terms of market prospections at the continental level. Because if you look at the quantity of import that are coming from outside the continent, that means there is a market within the continent for businesses. Second point, there are specific challenges as well to world implementations. We are talking about, yesterday I was talking about one of the, someone in Central Africa about the rule of origins. You have AFCFTA rule of origins, and you still have the REX rule of origin. And the heterogeneity among the rule of origin will make implementation a bit challenging, especially when it comes to conflicting rules. Personally, what I believe is we should take the FCFTA trade rules, including rule of origins, at kind of, big umbrella, and now revise the REX trade rules to align them to the FCFTA, because we cannot align FCFTA, which is continental, to the REX rule because there are too many REX and heterogeneity among trade rules. So now, last point I want to also make here, a lot of people have been talking about priority. COVID is not the priority, EFCFTA might not be the priority. But if you look at the picture clearly, the EFCFTA process will contribute in the longer term to reduce vulnerability. That's what we are talking about. So EFCFTA is a solution to COVID. Now, what is very important for me is when even governments are talking about dilemma, how do you prioritize between EFCFTA and COVID recovery requirement and other priority? Making today money available for businesses that have been hit severely by COVID will help also them build stronger capacity to produce to our AFCFTA market. So for me, I think wherever we have chance or opportunity to work on AFCFTA or COVID recovery strategies, we should look at building synergy, because AFCFTA is part of the solution to COVID-19. Thank you.
That really is what we're talking about, right? So it's about using the resources we have and then supercharging them with the resourcefulness, having that goal in mind, seeing things as a means to an end, right? Seeing it as a tool rather than a problem that shifts everything, and that also would have everyone work towards the same goal. So that's super important. That's a great one, Komi. And I'm going to have to congratulate Martha, who has now taken on and covered the Mission Impossible. Dun, 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 dun. She is now actually, during our talk, made us in to the airport and through security, and the mask is on. Martha, did you manage to hear the question?
Yes, I heard the question. Can you hear me?
We hear you fine, thank you.
Okay. So for me, I'm going to divide my answer into aspects. I completely agree with Komi, what he said. Actually, I do think the ACFTA, it is the solution and can fill that policy space that is lacking from the monetary and fiscal perspective. But what is needed, it is coordination and good governance. Because if we want to a regulatory environment and we want to harmonize the rules and facilitate trade, and governments need to care about their neighbors and facilitate those infrastructure, at the end, we need coordination. But at the micro level, what we need is to hear what the firms need, what the traders need, and how those firms can increase their trading potential. What do they need? Which is it may be different what the government think that they may be doing, but they need to actually engage with those firms, maybe in private and public partnerships, and maybe just asking their not only the multinationals, but the small traders and the medium-sized traders, what do they need? And precisely what I've been hearing in Africa, it is that they need funding. They need access to funding, and they need education to engage in the fourth industrial revolution. Africa, it is composed by very young population with great ideas, and they are engaged in the digital era. So what they need is the support, the government support, to be able to trade what they produce. And not only outside the continent, but also across. And for that, you need good governance, cooperation, regulatory environment, but also to go to the nitty-gritty level, which is the firms. What firms are needed? I'm quite sure I couldn't listen to Anne, but I'm quite sure she was pointing out that more education is needed, more support to women entrepreneurs. Then we need networks, to establish networks and focus them on how to actually push up all that potential. So at the macro level, harmonization, cooperation, good governance, which is difficult because there is high heterogeneity across those countries. We can't compare Nigeria to South Africa, but they need to cooperate, or Benin, which is a very small country. But those need to cooperate. But at the micro level, they need to ask their citizens and their firms, what do you need to be successful? And that I find that sometimes that is missing. But with the ACFTA, we have the opportunity to actually push that process and engage in that process. And with the COVID and with the pandemic, some countries have had uncoordinated responses, but others didn't. So let's focus on the goods. Let's focus on taking that momentum and building up on that. Thank you.
Excellent, Martha. Now we have one question, and it is way beyond me because I'm an economist and I know nothing about law. So I'm going to put that right out there. And I'm so hoping, so I'm going to read the question, and maybe Koholo has a quick answer, or at least we can give the person who asks it a source for where to go. And then I would like to get you all to make a 30-second sort of sum up of your presentation for the people who were in bed, who put their alarms on, who happened to fall asleep and came back on and now are trying to summarize. So think about that while I read the question for Koholo. So the question is from Aki Raina. And the question is, for judicial implementation of the AFCFTA treaty between its members. Is the regional dispute settlement mechanism, Articles 5 and 6, so the person obviously knows their stuff, is a suitable avenue, or would African countries continuing to take their trade dispute to the multilateral plane?
That is a very good question, because the answer is it depends. It depends because the EAC and COMESA seem to have quite an active, well, let me not say quite an active. Let me start with this. African regional settlement systems are not very much used, if not at all, for trade issues. But we have seen cases at the COMESA level and at EAC, one each. Now, I think the question we have to take a step back. If African countries are not using the REC dispute settlement system, African countries are going to use the AFCFTA, the dispute settlement system. And also, we see low participation in the WTO multilateral dispute settlement system, although we have Morocco, Tunisia, and Egypt, and South Africa has been a respondent in about 6 cases. So I think the question is, are they going to be used? And I think that's a very interesting question, because the answer is we don't know going forward if African countries are going to have any motivation to resolve trade disputes. But it doesn't mean that Africans do not have trade disputes between themselves. Of course they do. But either they are not resolved, and this results in obviously traders not trading, or loss of market access, or if the company is big enough, they're resolved at the diplomatic level. So we're looking forward to seeing, if the dispute settlement system of the AFCFTA is going to be used at all, or how we're going to resolve trade disputes in Africa.
Excellent. We have 2 minutes. So I love that it depends, because it sounds like an economist. So we got 30 seconds each. Why don't you go first, since we have you, Koholo? Your best takeaway.
My take is African countries need to imagine the type of regional trading environment that we want to have. And I think African countries should start looking at Africa as an opportunity and as a huge market to exploit. Of course, we have traditional exporting partners outside of Africa, but maybe it's time to really put our mouths, or to put, our trade where our mouths is at, and really trade within the continent.
Excellent. Thank you, Martha.
Sure. Message. So the ACFTA has actually the potential to promote that integration, regional integration, that is highly needed. And let's take it further. Let's take it one more level. Let's ensure that implementation can be possible, which is not clear now.
Got it. Thank you, Komi.
So, of course, I think for last word, the FCFTA clearly is the solution for African economy to build stronger market, to to be more resilient in the future. There will be challenges, that is true, but the challenges should not discourage us. We should work toward make it a reality. Thanks.
Thank you. Anna.
Thank you. I would echo everything that other speakers have said, particularly what Koholo said about really using this as an opportunity. I've been rooting for this FTA for a long time as a way forward for the region, for the continent. But I do want to say that I guess my key point is that this agreement will face the same challenges in implementation that have been faced by all the other FTAs. So we can't be naive. If we don't address these issues that have been around for decades, this agreement will share the fate of other agreements, which would be a massive shame. So I hope the pandemic will be an opportunity to rethink how trade is done.
Got it. Thank you. And you have the last spot, the last 30 seconds.
Okay. Thank you, Hannah. Yes, I do have to agree with everyone, because I definitely think that the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement offers an opportunity to correct the development challenges that Africa has faced in the past. And if it is implemented successfully, it will ensure that SMEs owned by women, because that's the focus we have at OIT Nairobi, and the youth have the ability to take up the opportunities brought about by the free trade agreement, ensure there is more intra-Africa trade, as it's the only way for communities to be transformed, jobs to be created, and poverty eradicated on the African continent. I do have to say that if this is done well and there is more intra-Africa trade, we need to see more of the export of value-added goods and the export of professional services to the world by Africans. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. Thank you, all the panelists. Thank you, Geneva Trade Week 2020. And thank you to everyone who has listened. I was so psyched and so excited coming into this session. I knew it was going to be great. And you even, it was even better than I had imagined. So thank you so much, everyone. And if there are any more questions, reach out to us and we'd be happy to try to follow that up. To everyone, have a really great day, and to Malta, have a good flight. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.